Real Stories Tapes True Crime is your new true crime podcast fix. In our first season, we'll explore suspicious deaths at a California hospital and a skydiver landing dead on a suburban driveway with a bag containing guns, drugs, and night vision goggles. To join our investigation, search and subscribe to Real Stories Tapes True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
They should be the most innocent members of society. But children can be capable of the most sadistic, premeditated, and brutal murders.
They beat him and hit him with a bottle. One of them stabbed Jay straight through the heart.
What drives these kids to kill men, women, friends, family?
She was determined that her mother had to die.
Even their teachers.
This was the first occasion upon which a teacher had been killed in class in the course of conducting a lesson.
Could they be born evil?
He did have a weird, dark sense of humour. He was a little bit different to most of the other kids.
He was aggressive, threatening, and dangerous.
Or are they victims of their environment?
There was a lot of gangs, there was a lot of violence, a lot of drug abusers.
With exceptional access to real police tapes.
The voices are talking to me. You need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you. You need to do it.
And interviews with those closest to the victims and the perpetrators.
A red mist had simply descended.
We reveal what made them such savage killers. In the summer of 2013, 19-year-old Sean McHugh was found bleeding to death in an alleyway in Liverpool.
Did you destroy our life?
He'd been chased into a laundrette and cornered in the back room.
And it was 6.5 minutes of sheer terror.
Where he was fatally stabbed by a gang of 5 teenage boys, deemed by the media as baby-faced killers.
Now, what exactly happened behind that door, I don't think we'll ever know.
Led by their 19-year-old ringleader, some of these boys were as young as 13 years old.
In my 26 years, this is the only time that I've dealt with a murder that's involved people charged with a murder under the age of 16.
With the CCTV released to the police, the boys were quickly arrested. Even at trial, they appeared totally unfazed by the seriousness of their crime.
Their only remorse was that they got caught.
What turned these young individuals into a marauding mob out for blood? Anfield, Liverpool, is a residential district to the north of the city centre. Those who live here say it has a strong sense of community. However, there's no ignoring it has its issues.
Anfield itself is a tough, gritty, rough and ready inner city suburb. There are some great salt-of-the-earth people there. It's a tight-knit community, but there are, massive issues with deprivation and poverty and kids entering crime at an early age.
Having worked as a probation officer in North Liverpool for 18 years, James Riley has experience working with convicted young killers.
I run a programme called Get Away and Get Safe, which is an intervention which is delivered around the country for young people, hopefully to deter them from getting involved in gangs. Like many other inner city areas, we have problems with gangs and street violence.
Sean McHugh was a 19-year-old boy from the neighbouring suburb of Walton. With a job as an apprentice bricklayer, he lived with his girlfriend close to Anfield. But on the 30th of September 2013, what should have been a mundane evening for Sean in and around the local area turned into a living nightmare.
Sean and his friend Joshua Williams were on Priory Road to do some laundry. He wanted to wash his and his girlfriend's clothes, and they gone to the Liver laundrette to do that.
He didn't realise that it probably took 30 to 45 minutes for the wash cycle to take place, so decided to walk with his friend Josh round to the local stores round the corner. Whilst there, he was confronted by or bumped into the Laneheads, as they called themselves. They were a group of young kids who were involved in relatively low-level antisocial behaviour. A bit of verbals were exchanged. The group actually basically said to Sean, what were they doing around there? It wasn't his area.
Both the lads knew something bad was going to happen, so they ran.
The victim ran in to a local laundrette, being pursued by a number of males. He was split up from his friend at the time, who ran in another direction.
Sean ran into the back room, but not before he'd handed a phone to a person working there, telling her, call the police.
Can you please to the laundress on Priory Road? Someone just run in and blocked the doors in the office, and there's someone outside in the shop hall kicking the door in.
One of the members of the gang even threw down some detergent so that if he tried to get away, he'd slip up and fall over and make him an easier prey.
Before they actually began the chase, some of the group went and recovered some weapons from the cinder path, which was very close to the shop.
They then took out this antique sword stick, this cane sword, and went back to the laundrette. There was one man in the laundrette who was doing his washing, who later said that he tried to act like he was the manager of the laundrette in the hope that these youths would scarp her.
The boys took no notice of him, so that in itself shows an intention.
If you look at the CCTV, they're running around him, and to his credit, he stays there as long as he can, but I think he must have feared for his own safety and leaves. The police had already been alerted to this point, and the gang knew that, so their mission was all the more urgent: break through that door.
As soon as the door had been forced into the staff area, Sean then managed to escape out of the rear of the premises into the alleyway. Members of the gang followed him into the alleyway where, Sean stumbled, fell to the floor, and one member of the group, which member we don't know, used the sword stick and stabbed Sean through his left leg, went in to a depth of approximately 11 centimetres and severed his femoral artery.
And it was 6.5 minutes of sheer terror. What must have been going through his head, knowing that he was trapped like that and that there were these yobs armed trying to get at him, God only knows.
It's difficult to comprehend how much fear Sean McHugh would have been in when faced with that mob. The natural instinct in human beings when in dangerous situations is to do one of three things: fight, flight, or freeze. In this situation, Sean McHugh couldn't fight. There were simply too many of them. He couldn't freeze because they would have attacked him. So he did the only thing he could. He ran.
Sean was found bleeding really heavily in the back of the laundrette, and a member of the public tried his best to stem the bleeding.
Having lost too much blood, Sean McHugh died in hospital 4 days after the attack.
This was a shocking crime for Liverpool, as it would be for any city. There's no getting away from it that, there are areas in Liverpool which are unsafe, and you can find trouble if you go looking for it, but never do you think that when you go into a laundrette to do your washing that you're about to lose your life.
He was someone's son. He was someone's brother. He was someone's best friend.
Sean McHugh's tragic murder left his family, girlfriend, and his whole community totally devastated.
Sean was very close to his family, especially to his mum Lorraine, lived with his girlfriend Stephanie, again close to his brothers and sisters. Real close-knit, I describe him as a real typical Liverpool family. Really looked up to and respected his mum.
Here's his gang here, his little girlfriend. She was 14 when he met.
Sean McHugh, nicknamed Shorty, was really popular in his community in Walton. More than 1,000 people turned up at his funeral. He was short, hence his nickname, but full of character. He was into fishing and motorbikes.
Everybody liked Sean. That was the thing that came through very quickly through the investigation, that nobody really disliked Sean. There's nothing to dislike about Sean. He wasn't involved in criminality or gangs. Everybody was shocked that this would take place in their community.
Despite steering clear of the violence that plagued his local streets, that night Sean had found himself spotted on the Laneheads gang territory.
Quite simply, they're called the Laneheads because they congregated and hung round upon the cinder path on Townsend Lane. I wouldn't say they were a notorious gang. They were a group of young kids who were involved in predominantly low-level antisocial behaviour. For some of them, the first ever offence they committed was murder.
The Laneheads' head honcho was Rhys O'Shaughnessy. There was Kiefer Dykstra, who was his kind of second in command. He was kind of this big, for his age, teenager who kind of used his size to intimidate others. Then there were the Hewitt cousins, Corey and Andrew, and Joseph McGill. Their fierce rivalry was with the Walton village heads, who they nicknamed the Walton Rats. The people that Sean would hang out with in Walton would have been members of the Walton village heads. They would have known people who were members of the Walton village heads. And because of that, the Laneheads would have known that Sean was affiliated to them.
Several months before the attack on Sean, Kiefer Dykstra got stabbed during a fight with members of the Walton village heads. And when the opportunity arose, they'd set out to avenge that stabbing.
So when they saw him in Priory Road, given 2.5 months earlier when Kiefer Dykstra had been stabbed in the chest by somebody linked to the Walton village heads, that's why he was targeted for reprisal.
The only reason he was attacked because he come from Walton, so he was picked on merely because of his postcode.
What's critical in this case is that Sean McHugh, unfortunately for him, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was not planned. I don't think they saw Sean McHugh as another human being. They saw him as an object. I think they saw him as a symbol of the opposing group from another area, and they were attacking him because of what he represented in their eyes. That one of them had been stabbed by another group in a different geographical area, and they wanted to take revenge. And it didn't really matter that it wasn't Sean McHugh who committed that act of violence. They just wanted to seek revenge to anybody who was different to them, the opposing group to them.
What factors in these teenagers' lives turned them into a gang of knife-wielding killers?
These were school-age kids killing another kid.
In the early evening on the 30th of September 2013, 19-year-old Sean McHugh had been doing his and his girlfriend's laundry when he was cornered and fatally stabbed by a local gang. Shockingly, a gang with members as young as 13 years old. These 5 teenage boys had outnumbered Sean and hunted him down as a pack.
When these young people are together, they behave differently. I often look at some of these high-profile cases and think, would that person or would those boys have acted the same way if they were on their own? And the answer is usually no. But when they're with others, they feel less responsible for their actions.
When I examine the CCTV, it's particularly horrifying to watch. What we see here is a pack mentality going towards the door, determined to break down that door to commit harm to Sean. In a pack mentality, it's a group situation. And in that group, the individuals lose their own singular identity and they take on the identity of the group, acting for one thing. And in this case, the group's identity was about committing harm, was about being violent.
Some people describe it as, being like animals on a hunt. I would sometimes describe them just as simply being like sheep and following one another.
With more than one suspect to track down, and in a climate where there was fear of reprisals for talking, the police had a daunting task ahead of them.
In Anfield, after the killing and in the days after, graffiti started to emerge. Snitches get stitches, and FTM, which means fuck the Matrix. The Matrix is the police's kind of anti-gang unit. There is an attitude amongst the gangs that, you know, that the Matrix are the enemy. This could have been a notoriously difficult case for police to solve because the gangs wouldn't speak to the police, but these tearaways with their lust for violence were kind of victims of their own downfall. They caught themselves by posting messages on Facebook and sending text messages, you know, just hours after the event.
Evidence recovered from the mobile phones of the offenders was crucial. That gave us evidence to show their involvement and knowledge of what happened to Sean. There was derogatory comments about R.I.P. Shorty, always knew you were a pussy.
These messages were whizzing through the ether, saying things like, watch out, you might see something that we've done on Priory in the paper tomorrow, or he's only got 3 days to live.
We need to look here at the activity of the boys on Facebook after the incident. They were bragging about what happened, how long it would take him to bleed to death, etc. When you look at that, it looks like the boys are callous and show no remorse. But what actually is going on? Why are they so detached from what they've done? When we look at knife crime, we see a total disrespect for life. Like, life isn't important. And when somebody is so detached from how absolutely wonderful life is, it means that they can joke about it because it's something they're seeing everywhere. They're seeing crime, they're seeing knife crime. It's not as shocking as it is to most people in society. So when they're making these jokes online, it's shocking to us. To them, it's just part of what they do.
After their gloating on social media and having been identified on the CCTV, the police were able to quickly arrest the members of the Lanehead gang. And it soon came to light that these teens were local troublemakers.
The leader of the gang was Rhys O'Shaughnessy. He was 19 years of age.
He was almost this Pied Piper who kind of led this merry band of marauding yobs who were aged as young as 13, you know, in Anfield along Priory Road. They would do his bidding.
They were known to the local policing teams, so some of our uniformed colleagues did know them, because again, they were just involved really in low-level antisocial behaviour in the area, causing a nuisance really.
These were kids with real issues. They were kind of in and out of school. They bunked off all the time. They were hanging around late at night and causing misery for the community. When they would go to school, they'd finish and kind of loiter around on street corners, intimidating others, you know, a general catalogue of antisocial behaviour.
When I'm looking at the profile of the boys involved here, we see a pattern of poverty. They all come from what we call vulnerable locations, areas that have high crime, high unemployment. They were in trouble with the police, they were often not in school, they were getting into lots of trouble in the local area. And what that tells me is that there must have been some lack of boundaries in these young boys' lives.
With few boundaries at home, and having been assessed as having very low IQs, the boys struggled to fit into conventional schooling and turned to the streets.
They were all in alternative education provisions. The majority had been excluded from mainstream school. Some of them had problematic family lives. A number of them struggled at school. They were persistently absent from school.
The boys had low intelligence and poor cognitive ability. And what that means is that they would be more easily led, less able to make sensible decisions, and less aware of the consequences of their actions. And in the case of Corey Hewitt, he had an IQ of 69 that puts him in the very low category of intelligence. So he actually had a mental age of about a 6 or 7-year-old. So for him to understand the consequences of what he's doing is really difficult. He's in a situation where he's going along with the group activity and he has this low IQ and he almost isn't aware of the consequences of what he is about to do.
What led these 4 young teenagers to follow and look up to a 19-year-old and become part of his gang?
They entered gangs as a way to belong to a kind of fraternity. They weren't necessarily involved in drug dealing. It was being part of a gang, sticking up for your turf and, dispensing violence and threats on people from rival gangs who had come onto your territory.
There's a whole host of reasons why young people will get involved in gangs. Maybe being excluded from school, being on the streets, having no purpose, no identity, time on their hands, nothing better to do.
The gang gave them that sense of belonging, sense of group, sense of purpose that maybe they didn't get through schooling or at home.
Some of these young people just simply lacked a positive male role model. Sadly, they found that role model on the streets, someone they thought was a friend, someone they thought cared about them, but actually they're just about to be used.
With the boys looking up to their older leader, it's evident they found a sense of belonging in the Laneheads. Given how young these teenagers were, to what extent was them joining the gang a conscious choice?
I think sometimes we can be slightly naive with gangs. I think that if you're a young person living on a housing estate and a gang is on that housing estate, there are kids that would tell you that if you're not part of the gang, you must be against that gang, and therefore that gang will turn on you.
In these suburbs of Liverpool, there's enormous peer pressure, and one of the ways to kind of get your kudos is to be a member of a gang. So if you were in a gang, while the rest of society would see you as a bit of a street urchin, to your peers and to other people of that age, it was a mark of respect.
Young people don't think that deep about why they join in a gang. They might be a group of friends that they know, they might be a group of friends that they've born and been brought up with.
There's massive appeal to these boys to belong to a gang. What belonging to a gang often gives young people is a sense of identity. They're often referred to as street families, where they don't have their own positive identity, they take on the identity of the gang. And also, in an area where there's high crime, that also gives them a sense of security, a sense of belonging, a sense of protection. I'm with my gang and I'm okay when I'm here. It gives them support. So to not be part of that group would have been very difficult.
By virtue of growing up around Townsend Lane in Anfield, these impressionable young boys became part of the Laneheads gang. By entering into this world of street violence, had they lost their sense of what was right and wrong?
My personal view is that you may have an IQ of 69, you may have a limited vocabulary, you still at that age know the difference between right and wrong. You still know the difference between getting a weapon, chasing somebody and stabbing them and killing them, to not doing that at all. From my point of view, you can say what you like about fractured backgrounds, you can say what you like about opportunities that these kids have, but there are plenty of other kids in Anfield and Walton that don't go around killing people.
Since the police were unable to determine who had delivered the fatal blow, would the whole group go down for murder? In September 2013, Sean McHugh from Walton, Liverpool, was stabbed simply for being on a rival gang's turf, despite never having been involved in a gang himself. The suspects were all identified and arrested within 24 hours of the attack.
These tearaways, with their lust for violence, were kind of victims of their own downfall.
Led by 19-year-old Rhys O'Shaughnessy, shockingly, the other 4 gang members responsible for Sean's death were under 16 years old. With the police investigation unable to identify which boy had delivered the fatal blow, the court proceedings would have to decide if they should all be found guilty of murder.
It was tense in court. It really was. You know, these were young kids. Their families insisted that, although they were involved in the incident, they didn't stab Sean, so they weren't guilty of murder. Whereas Sean's family were insisting, throw away the key. These kids were together. Their actions led to the death of Sean.
Everybody involved in this were charged with the murder of Sean McHugh. The law at the time allowed for the charge of joint enterprise. The law of joint enterprise at that time is a common law offence, been around for hundreds of years, which is for a group acting with a common purpose. And the common purpose, we said on that evening, was to cause significant harm and significant injury to Sean McHugh. In cases like this, allows for that charge to take place when actually we don't know who delivered the fatal blow.
Having been charged under joint enterprise, the trial centred on the intentions of the 5 boys the night Sean was stabbed.
It was the prosecution's case that they intended for the deceased to suffer serious harm that day. For me, it was just swept along in a series of events that, unfortunately, for the deceased, for everyone concerned, had fatal consequences.
Under joint enterprise, they all had this mob mentality. Sean died as a result of them acting like this pack of animals. So from my point of view, it was clearly right to charge them all with murder and take it to trial.
Individually, these were young people who were antisocial. They were in trouble with the police. They were up to no good. But individually, were they all murderers? We don't know. What we do know is when they collectively came together, they turned into murderers.
In court, all 5 of the boys pleaded not guilty to murder. However, using evidence from the CCTV and witnesses, the prosecution suggested the group had serious intent to harm Sean.
The gang went in there screaming, "We're going to kill you, we're going to get you." Whether it was intended or not, they had the foresight that Sean would be caused really serious injury. As you see with kind of knife crime incidents all too often, there's no safe place to stab somebody. If you plunge a blade into somebody, there's no telling what damage you'll do.
It only takes, as in this case, to use the knife once, to use it on a part of the body where you don't think it'll cause death. In the case of Sean, they stabbed him in the leg. He died very quickly as a result.
The moment that they all knew that at least 2 of their members were armed, that was when in fact joint enterprise came in.
It didn't matter who actually delivered the fatal injury. The whole group, as a collective, knew there was knives present. They knew the knife was going to be used, and they knew the knife was going to be used to cause significant injury to Sean.
One of the things that stuck with me since this trial is not only the manner in which Sean was killed, but the foresight shown by a then 13-year-old boy to spray detergent on the floor just in case Sean did manage to get back out from the back room, that his escape would be impeded and that he'd slip. You can see the intent there.
From Joseph McGill pouring down the detergent to Corey Hewitt picking up and disposing of the murder weapon down a drain, Sean McHugh's murder was presented in court as a collective endeavour.
What role they played in this murder made it a joint effort by them to intend to cause serious injury to Mr. McHugh.
What happens when we look at joint enterprise? We have people who are actively involved. We have people who are goading the person who commits the violence along, so therefore are actively involved. And then we have people on the fringe who may be feeling anxious and nervous, but go along with the situation because they feel that they can't get out of it. So within joint enterprise, it's always a hierarchy of who has committed the most serious aspect of the incident.
Despite being on trial for murder, the boys never seemed to gauge the seriousness of what was unfolding in court.
The atmosphere in court was different depending on which way you looked. You know, if you looked to the victim's side, there was, a kind of constant flood of tears, tissues and sobbing. And then if you looked to the defendants, it was like they were on holiday. They were laughing and joking and smirking. They were tossing paper at one another. One of the boys who was on bail was actually remanded into custody during the trial because of his conduct.
Their true age kind of shone through throughout the court process. They were misbehaving within the dock. For me, they just didn't take that whole process, the whole trial, as serious as it was for them and for the justice for Sean and his family.
What do you think about the conduct of these boys during the trial? And they were clearly showing no respect for the court.
They were just laughing at us. Smirking all the time and wouldn't give up. Had to leave the cause.
There were kind of almost constant warnings from the judge telling these boys to behave, and they would for a little bit, but then they would get distracted. One would laugh, which would set off the other. And it got to a point where Judge Goldstone just thought, well, the jury can see this, they can see how you're acting, so we're just going to carry on. Behave as you will, we've got a trial to crack on with.
With all of the boys being so young, and 3 of them suffering from ADHD, sitting together in the dock proved problematic. One of the boys who suffered from ADHD was 14-year-old Kiefer Dijkstra.
The more that I dealt with Kiefer, that I realised just how severe that condition was in his case. His concentration clearly went out the window. He would make inappropriate remarks at inappropriate times. I would not deem it as behaviour that you would not expect outside the classroom. It was obviously young boys put in a very adult situation.
Looking at their behaviour, is it disrespectful? Yes. Is it a sign of how antisocial they are? Yes. But I also think it shows how they've got absolutely no respect for the law, and that's something we see in cases like this. They've got no respect for authorities. But then I think we also have to consider some of the factors involved here. We know at least 3 of them have got ADHD. We know that they've got problems with cognitive reasoning, which means that they would struggle to retain information, would struggle to understand information, and would struggle to remember what is being said, which means they then get distracted. In addition, the fact that they were all together, they're continuing with the bravado, the act, look, I'm hard, this isn't bothering me, I don't care about the system. That's why we saw the behaviour we saw in court.
You could say that, okay, they had low intelligence, their IQ was low. Did they understand the gravity of what they'd done? Or was this a front? Were they putting on a show to go, we're hard, we're tough, the big I ams, and we don't care what you do to us? And my view is that it falls on the latter. They understood what was going on in court. They understood what they were up for. I think to a large part they enjoyed being there. They didn't like the result, but they certainly liked being the centre of attention.
With the boys acting up in full view of the jury, was their behaviour the result of an inability to understand the consequences of the crime? Or did they simply not care that they were on trial for murder? On the 30th of September 2013, a gang of teenagers from Anfield killed 19-year-old Sean McHugh from the neighbouring suburb of Walton.
Sean was still a young lad himself. The offenders in this case were even younger, so that is, for me, one of the saddest things about this whole case.
Throughout the trial, the 5 boys, some as young as 13, showed little remorse. Under the law of joint enterprise, the jury had to decide if all the boys had intended to cause Sean serious harm that evening, and as a result, were each guilty of murder.
You know, I met Lorraine probably 24 hours after this happened, and Lorraine is still as emotional today as she was then.
It just destroys our lives.
After more than 17 hours of deliberation, the jury found ringleader 19-year-old Rhys O'Shaughnessy and Kiefer Dykstra, who was 14 at the time of the murder, guilty by a unanimous decision. 15-year-old Andrew Hewitt, Corey Hewitt and Joseph McGill, both 13 years old at the time of the murder, were also found guilty by a majority verdict of 10-2.
When the guilty verdicts were given at the end of the trial, again, they were kind of nonchalant with their reactions. It was as though they weren't bothered about what they'd just been convicted of.
When Judge Goldstone came into court to deliver his sentence, the first thing he did was issue a warning to everyone in the court to stay quiet when the sentences were delivered, and if they didn't, they would have him to answer to. But when those verdicts were delivered, the kind of rules and decorum went out the window. There were shrieks on one side of kind of joy at these life sentences being handed out. There were shrieks from the other side of disbelief that their sons had been convicted of murder and were going to be detained for life.
A sentence of that magnitude is a lot for an adult to take in, let alone a child.
The judge sentenced on the basis that Rhys O'Shaughnessy plunged the cane sword into Sean's leg. He had never admitted it, but the evidence of another of the boys implicated him. It was the perfect way of bringing this gang to justice. This was a way of saying, hang on, if you're going to associate in these gangs and you're going to do things like this, then if somebody dies, you're all going to go down.
In total, 5 people convicted of Sean's murder received 53 years in prison. The shortest sentence was 6 years, and the longest sentence of 18 years was given to the oldest member of the group. For me, justice was served with the guilty verdict of the 5 people. That brought some closure for Lorraine and the family.
I'm just glad we got justice for Sean. So I wanted to thank everybody for what they've done for us.
Sean's family were so torn up by his killing that no sentence that could have been handed out by the court would ever give them true closure. You know, they were happy that they were given life sentences. They were happy that they were all convicted of murder under joint enterprise. You know, it was a justice of sorts, but as the judge said, the real life sentence will always hang over the McHugh family. They're the one whose son's never coming back.
The judge said in all of these boys' lives there was a lack of structure, and absolutely I can see that in looking at the cases. They didn't have boundaries. They didn't have that they needed to be home and doing their homework and attending school. And when you have children without boundaries, that is a recipe for disaster. 2 of the most important things I see are the importance of attachment and the importance of boundaries. And if a child hasn't got that, they're led to their own devices. And on the streets of an area that's got a high crime rate, they're going to be attracted to antisocial behaviour.
In the judge's summing up of the case, he concluded that it spoke volumes for the advantages of a structured lifestyle. And with all the boys having displayed very little regret, would the structure of prison yield any change?
I don't know if time will change them. I really don't. During the trial, could I say that any of them had shown an ounce of remorse? No. Obviously, have served a hefty chunk of time in prison. They will have had to undergo rehabilitation programs, but the truth is, we'll only know when they get out. We'll only know when they get out.
At the time of the offence took place, I don't think they regretted it. Throughout the trial, I don't think they took it seriously, and I don't think they regretted it then. But I think as time has passed and they've had time to really reflect, grow up and be educated further within the prison establishments, that has helped them come to understand the consequence of their actions and actually regret what they did on that night. But I do have genuine belief in the prison system will help them rehabilitate themselves if they want to be rehabilitated. So yeah, I do feel that there is opportunities for all of them to rehabilitate. I do hope that there are a chance for them in the future.
When we look at them and we look at what they did and where they come from, actually, a young offenders institution could offer them, particularly the younger ones, more stability, more boundaries, more hope, more structure than they've ever had before. So they could end up having an education and turning their life around. Rehabilitation, however, will be harder for the older offender. He'll be going to an adult prison, and depending on what therapy or treatment program is available to him, he will struggle to change his behaviour more because he's older and his behaviour is more ingrained.
In the judge's sentencing remarks, he described the boys' involvement with knives as part of their way of life. Had they never been drawn into street violence, Sean would still be alive, and it is a problem that continues today.
I think if you fast forward to now, the UK is gripped by a knife crime epidemic. This is 6 years later and there are still kids walking around with knives. They're not afraid to use them. They say they have them for protection. It's not a defence. So you look back at 6 years ago and you go, well, how much has really changed? The answer's not a lot. Has the problem got worse? Probably. We need to completely rethink our outlook to knife crime. We should have learnt more, really, from what happened to Sean. We should have got tougher then, and we really need to get tougher now.
People do not think of the consequences of arming themselves with a knife. If you take a knife out, you are more likely to use a knife. On this occasion, they arm themselves with a knife with the intention to use it without thinking of the actual fatal consequences of what happened to Sean.
With the problem of knife crime deemed to be endemic in the UK, how could Sean's murder have been prevented? And what can be done to stop young people being drawn into this way of life?
Young people are carrying knives nowadays because they think many other young people are carrying knives. There's a very small minority of people carrying knives, that's been proven. Young people should never be in a position where they think carrying a weapon, any weapon at all, makes them safer. Because in a moment of madness, they could use that weapon. And lives will be changed forever. If you don't give someone hope, and if you can't make life exciting, give them exciting opportunities, they have less choices. And I think that's our problem with young people.
These boys were living a life with no hope, with no opportunity. Their life was the streets. And because they had no hope, that led to them having little respect for life. Because what is life? Life wasn't giving them anything. So to take a life was no big deal.